Well, my project of the day, probably of the week, is to work on my dump trailer. This is a 16-foot hydraulic dump trailer. Got two 7,000-pound Dexter axles on it. I got it built in Tacoma, Washington, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. Hauled a lot of logs, but mostly a lot of rock and gravel. We get permit from the Forest Service and go get gravel out of some of the old rock pits and stuff around. It takes a lot of abuse. I've been watching it. I keep an eye on it when I'm using it, and I noticed the other day that a spring shackle over there on the other side was just about ready to fall off. Well, now it has fallen off. I was going to just stop and take that off and make a pattern out of it and make another one out of a piece of steel. But when I got to looking, that next other side, opposite side from that one, was pretty well worn too. It's just about worn through on the head of that, and the bolts are kind of worn. And then I got to looking at this one over here on this side, and it's just about worn out too. And then those things only have a nylon bushing in that eye of that spring. There's not much there, and those bolts were worn out. So I got to looking online and found you could get the kits pretty cheap for them. But then I found that they had a heavy-duty kit with thicker shackles themselves, and then bolts with drilled for grease zerks and bronze bushings to go in those spring eyes. So I went ahead and got one of those kits for that. And then I got a kit to change the axles over to undersprung axles. I guess oversprung axles with the springs underneath, or the axles underneath the springs instead of over them. When I ordered this trailer, when I had this trailer built, I wanted it built low, so because they've got tracked excavators that I wanted to haul in it with steel tracks. And the steel tracks get kind of touchy going up and down the ramps on them if they're too steep, especially when it's wet. And so I wanted it low to make it easier to load that excavator in and out. And that portion of it worked real well. The problem is that the trailer sits so low that it drags back here when you go to dump a load. You raise the box up, and the gravel, sand, whatever, logs, whatever come out of it, and then they hang up on the lip back there, and the lip drags when you try to pull the trailer forward. So anyway, it wound up being a little bit of a mistake. I should have went ahead and had it made normal height. So I'm gonna put those axles underneath the springs instead of over them. I got a kit to do that. And then they noticed that spring hanger back there started to break. It sheared off, so we've got to replace that spring hanger. I replaced this one in the front on this right side here a couple years ago. I think I've got another one around someplace, but I can't find it, of course. What happens here on these spring hangers is that frame rail is only about 2.5 inches wide, and the spring hangers are about 3.5 inches wide. And so a lot of the spring hanger, well, the spring hangers wind up being welded on part way underneath that frame rail. They're not flush with the outside of it, and so the inside of it then sticks out quite a ways from the frame rail there, and so you get a lot of shear on this part of the spring hanger right here, and so eventually they wear and crack out. Now this one, when I put it on, I went ahead and welded it on, and then I run quite a few beads and built this area up, and this web, or this fillet, I put a fillet in here between this frame side and the spring hanger to try to spread some of that shear load out a little bit, and it seems to be working so far on that one. So I'll probably do that on the other one on the back. And I think I'll probably go ahead and clean up those ones on the other side and do the same thing with those. Got the trailer sitting on the jack in the front on some blocks underneath it, and it raised up on the tongue. I've got jacks back here on the back of the trailer to help stabilize the trailer when we load and unload heavy equipment and stuff in here. And so I'm going to put some blocks underneath that as jack so I don't have to crank them down quite so far. And I'll go ahead and jack the back end of the trailer up to get the wheels off the ground. And then we'll pull the wheels out of there and probably start taking those springs apart. Getting that up in the air and then getting those wheels off will give me quite a bit of area to work on. And then I'll go ahead and raise that that box up even higher. I just got it up a little ways just to drain the water out and stuff. I'll go ahead and raise that box up even higher, and I'll have to put a brace underneath it to keep it, safety brace underneath it to make sure it doesn't fall down, but that'll give me a lot of room to work on that. A lot more than if it was just a camp trailer or something. I got the trailer jacked up, the wheels off, the tires off, and then I was cleaning up those bolts and stuff there and I wire brushed the threads on the nuts and put some penetrating oil on them. I actually been putting penetrating oil on them for a few days. I went to get that one off and there was no way it was coming off, so I just went ahead and got the hot wrench and cut everything off. So it's all loosened up there now. I'll go get a hammer and punch and knock those pins and stuff out and get everything apart. We'll get all the axles and the springs disconnected from the trailer frame. That's the bottom of the axle there, where the U-bolt's hooked onto it. I have to take those and clean them up, and they get reinstalled back onto the axles according to the kit. You can see how the spring shackles are kind of pretty well worn out there. They're rubbed up. Both holes are worn out on them. Let's see there. See, those bolts are pretty well worn out there right around where they went through those shackles too. Both sides. This one here is that hole's pretty hogged out. And there's the see, that is a plastic bushing that goes in there in that spring or through that piece. See, that's pretty much wore out there too. Anyway, I guess it was time to change those out. That bolt is pretty well, you can't see it very well, but that bolt, get in the sunshine a little bit, it's pretty well chewed up there where it's been wore in that shackle on that top. And that was the good one. Now on the other side, I've got that spring hanger that come apart there. But rather than just go and grabbing all the parts and pieces and putting them all back in there, got to take the wire brush and clean everything all up, knock the rust down on everything, and put a little bit of exo rust or something on them. And the ones on the left side, I can just clean them up and put them back together. They're all in good shape. I may clean these welds up here a little bit where that bracket's welded on there and go ahead and run a fillet in there to try to beef that up a little bit where that spring hanger mounts. Kind of take the shear pressure off of that. A couple hours work with a wire brush, and I got this frame pretty well cleaned up, the rust off of it, and the outsides of these spring hangers. I'll have to get some kind of other brush to clean up the inside of the spring hangers. We still got to clean up some of the other parts and pieces, and I think I'm going to clean up around those axles a little bit too, and we'll start putting them back together. Cleanup takes longer than the repairs. I've had a little welding done here. Put a fillet in on these spring hangers on the left hand side. Hopefully by doing that, that'll transfer some of that load from this outer edge along this unsupported section up into the frame rail. That's the idea anyway. This is what they look like, and the weld there is plenty strong enough. There's no problem. The weld's not breaking or anything. It's just this unsupported section. It shears right along that weld or out here along that bend somewhere from the weight. So that's what I'm doing there. You see this one here sheared off right there just outside of the weld. Here's my welder. It's a Century 21 or Century 130 wire feed welder. It's a 110 volt. I've got it set up on a maximum right now at 9, 10, whatever. And my wire feed, I had it set in almost 6, but as I got farther and away from the ground clamp, I had to turn it down. The wire speed was a little too high. This thing works okay. It's too small for what I'm doing, but we can make it work. The problem with it, with these heavy welds, is that its duty cycle is only, I don't know, 10% or something like that. So, but what happens, the welder doesn't kick out as a circuit breaker kicks out. It's on a 20 amp circuit, and the 20 amp circuit breaker will kick out when it gets too hot. And well, then we're done for a while. So I'm done welding. I got this one built up pretty good. This is the middle one on the right side. And I built the one here. I welded to put that piece back on there, and then welded it up and built it up on the right side on the rear one. And so that's the welding. Now, it's been frosting at night with heavy dew, so all this that I ground off with the wire brush is all got rust on it again. It's getting kind of late now. It's going to get dewy again, and so I don't want to paint that. So I'll have to wait until tomorrow. Wire brush that all down again tomorrow and wipe it down with some paint thinner, and then I'll put some exo rust on it and get it painted. Yeah, it started raining out, so I got a little tent put up over the trailer frame there where I've been working on it. It's got some plastic, 10-foot wide plastic sheet, and since the trailer's all steel, I got these rare earth magnets here that I bought a couple years ago for odds and ends. Don't know what purpose exactly, but they work for this purpose pretty good. Just pull that plastic over the edge of the trailer and snap those magnets on it, and they hold them on pretty good. This isn't perfect, but it's good enough to keep the rain off, the water off of here. Came back in, it set for a little while and got rusty again, so I came in with a wire wheel and cleaned everything all off, and then I got in with a wire brush inside those brackets down there on the inside of them. Got everything all cleaned up, took the air and blew everything off, and then took a little bit of paint thinner and wiped it all down, get the loose rust off of it. Now you can see paint thinner is starting to dry up there a little bit, so I gotta wait till that all flashes off before I start painting. A little exo rust red primer to put on there first, and we got this paint shaker Harbor Freight here a couple of years ago. I don't remember what it was, 89 bucks or something like that, which is overpriced for what it is, but it sure makes a difference on the paint when we have it stored here and buy it. We get paint that we're going to use right away from the hardware store. We can have them put them in their paint shaker, but sometimes when we bring it home it sits for a while before we use it again. This is a lot nicer than opening up a can and trying to get all the stuff loosened up with a stick. So I'm just letting the paint go ahead and shake. It's been on there for a while now, but I'm going to go ahead and let it shake until that paint flashes off. I might as well get it good and mixed up. I got my second coat of paint on there today. Put the black on over the top of the primer, black finish coat over the top of the primer, and it's going to take a while before that stuff cures. The primer was still pretty soft. It went on really thick because it's really cold out here. It's well, it's not really cold. It's dropped down into the 40s. At least it's not into the 30s at night. Damp and cold. That primer was pretty soft, and the paint went on pretty thick. I finally thinned it out a little bit with some Xylon. It says not to thin it, but it was just like putting on putty and mud instead of paint. So I thinned it a little bit and went on a little bit better. So anyway, it's going to be in here in the tent for a few days while it dries until we can start working it. Well, it's been a couple days since I worked on the trailer. It's been cold and wet, and I wanted to give time for that paint to cure. It's still soft, but it's been 40 degrees or so, in the 40s, and really damp. That stuff doesn't cure very fast in the best conditions, but it went on really thick out of the can, and 2 layers of it, so it's curing now, but it's been pouring down rain out here. Oh, I did start working on it again today. I got the springs and drug them over here into the shop covered area, and then I went over them with the wire brush and cleaned the loose rust and the dirt off of them. Took all of the plastic bushings out of the eyes and all the bolts off of them, and then washed them down a little bit with some paint thinner. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and spray them with some paint, but I've got to go get a wire brush to clean out those eyes, those spring hanger eyes, so we can get those cleaned out and put those new bushings in there. This is the kit with the new, I don't know what that center thing is called there. Anyway, that's the new ones in there. I wasn't necessarily going to get new ones, but after looking at this hole in that one, you can see it's kind of hogged out a little bit there. So probably just as well. Plus the new ones have got brass bushings in them. So this is the old pieces here. There's the new yoke there, whatever that thing's called. It's got a zerd on it here on this top eye where the bushing goes in there. See here the bolts that go through there. See they're drilled for zerts. These are the plastic bushings that were in there. They're pretty well worn out on the weight side of them. This is one of the original bolts out of the hangers, the spring hangers. I think this came right out of one of the spring eyes, and I was cleaning those threads and stuff up on those. I was going to try to take them out and salvage them, but I went ahead and they were really tough to get started, so I went ahead and just took the torch and burned them off. And you can see how worn that is around that bolt where it was in that spring hanger, the shackle, whatever they want to call that. So it's just as well that I burnt those off and got new ones. Now here's comparison of the old spring hangers or spring shackles compared to the new ones. This is a heavy duty kit, and you can see the difference in the size, the thickness of the metal on those. Same size of the between the eyes, the holes, there's no difference there, but quite a bit of difference on the thickness of the metal, so they're a lot heavier duty. Oh, there's say brass bushings inside of that. Well, anyway, that'll be what's going on the trailer. That'll be a whole lot. You see these bolts here have knurls on them up here close to the head so that they press fit into these spring hangers, these shackle bars. And that way they don't twist and turn. The shackles don't turn on them like that. They'll go ahead and just turn on the bronze bushings and the grease. These are the bronze bushings that go in the springs and spring eyes. They come in the kit. I've got this tub of Cosmoline. Yeah, I don't know where it got it, but it's from Brownells. I've taken the Cosmoline and put in these eyes. So I cleaned these springs yesterday up and wire brushed them and got all the loose dirt and rust and stuff off of them, and then washed them down with some paint thinner, and I sprayed a coat of Exo Rust on them, and then I'd cleaned out the eyes with a wire brush. Well, I just took that Cosmoline and took a brush and coated the inside of those eyes with the Cosmoline, so it's better than grease for rust preventative. It'll dry up and seal up as a waxy seal, and it doesn't absorb moisture like grease does, so hopefully that'll help put a barrier in between that bronze and help seal up that those steel eyes. I painted these red, and the reason I painted them red is not so they'd stand out and to show off, but so that they would stand out, hopefully, and give a little bit of difference in color, whatnot underneath there when I look to inspect them for any damage. That way maybe a little easier than looking at everything black and seeing if spring hangers are broken or a spring is damaged or any other thing has caused some damage. They'll all probably wind up being brown and black from mud on them before long anyway, but that's just an idea that maybe that would help identify any problems that occur on them. So I've got the bushings in 3 of the springs, 3.5 of the springs. I'll go get that other bushing and drive it in this one, and then I'm done fooling with the springs for a while till I get ready to hang them. Now these bushings into these eyes, those are all driven in. The problem is that these eyes, none of them are round and the right proper size. Well, most of them aren't. A couple of them, the bolts here fit down in without any problem. You know, most of them they don't. There's one that fits down in without any problem, but most of them they don't fit down in without driving them in. Some of them are so misshapen I wouldn't want to try to drive them in anyway. These bolts are 9/16. If I'd have taken a 9/16 inch bolt and used it for a pilot to drive those in, they might have been a little better, but you say you see this one is almost a triangular instead of round. Now I've got some chucking reamers, but they only go up to 1/2 inch, so they wouldn't fit in here. And because these holes are pretty distorted, you probably couldn't just run a straight 9/16 reamer through those anyway. So I've got these adjustable reamers, and I've set this one down smaller. It'll go up to 9/16. I've set it down smaller, and they just fit in a T-handle, a tap handle. And so I'm going to take this and use it to ream out these holes. I'll ream them out first. Say this one's a little bit small. That one fits in there in that hole. That one I can cut a little bit out with it, and then I'll just gradually increase the size of that and just gradually ream those holes out until those bolts fit down in them freely. Now they need to fit down in there freely. That's why I didn't just try driving them in there, because if I drive them in there, there's not much point in having bronze bushings in there with grease in them if you drive them in, because then the bolts are just frozen in there, and then they won't pivot freely on there. So I need to open those up so that these bolts go down into those holes freely. They can still be fairly tight, but there has to be enough room they have to be able to pivot in the holes and put some grease in there. So anyway, this is adjusted small right now for all these holes. Maybe take a little bit out of that one. So I'll go ahead and take a little bit out of it and then just gradually increase the size of this reamer until I get it up to where those bolts fit down in there freely. I've made several runs through these bushings with this adjustable reamer, and I've got it so this bolt will fit tight into them right now. So I'm going to adjust that reamer out one more time and go down through and make one more pass through them and see how it goes. I got all of those bushings round now, reamed out. The bolts are a nice slip fit, a little bit tight on a couple of them still, but they fit in there pretty nice, a lot better than they did. They're not sloppy, so a couple of them I might have to just use a little bit of persuasion, just tap a little bit, but they slip in there pretty freely for the most part. Yeah, that goes better that direction than the other direction. So I'm going to get some paint thinner now and a rag and clean the inside of those up, make sure and get all of the shavings out of them, although they're just bronze shavings, so they're not too bad. And I can go ahead and start hanging these up on the trailer. Now that I got the bushings in the springs and got those reamed out to fit the bolts, everything's painted and ready to go, was ready to start putting these equalizers on. I guess these are called equalizers. They help the springs work together kind of as a walking beam instead of each individually. So anyway, they go in. This portion here hangs from the spring hanger on the frame, and then the springs attach into these other two. I've got the two equalizers hanging. I put them so that the zerts were facing backwards on both of them. And my reasoning for that was the idea that if any crap was going to get kicked on there that would damage the zert or plug it up, it would get kicked from the front. And so maybe, because most of the time we're going forward on this thing, so maybe by having that pushed backwards, it'll help protect that zert from getting plugged up or knocked off or anything like that. It's pretty well protected up in there, so it shouldn't get knocked off, but it's liable to get full of crap. Now, before I do the other ones, I'm going to have to round those holes out. A couple of these, the holes were elongated out on the spring hangers, and I welded them up a little bit. So I need to round those out and size them. I would have replaced those if I'd have been someplace where I could run to 6 Robles or someplace and get one. I just did what I could to patch these up. So I'll get a Dremel tool and a bolt for a pattern and grind out those holes and make sure they're the right size before I do anything else. I put the rear spring on first, and the reason I did that was just arbitrary. I didn't do anything with that bolt hole on that spring hanger, and it wasn't hogged out or anything, so it was pretty much the way it was. So I put the rear of the rear spring on first. As the front of the rear spring, where it attaches to the equalizers there, it's got a little bit more give to it and a little bit more play to it. It hangs down and you've got some working room adjustability on it with those shackles. And the rear one fits up in there, so it's a little tighter, so I put it in first. It was a little bit more difficult than putting the equalizer on. The bolt going in, it went through fine. It went through the hole on the other side of the spring hanger, and it went in through the bushing on the spring eye, and it went into this hole on this side, but then it didn't quite line up. So when I first tried to drive that bolt in to seat the knurl on it, it wouldn't go. I had to twist that spring around a little bit to get that bolt so that it lines up with the hole. So it's a shoulder bolt. The threads on that are smaller than what the bolt is. So just because you get the threads to line up and go through the hole doesn't mean the bolt will follow. Well, you kind of got to get it lined up to come through the hole to drive it in there. But we got that one in. So the next thing I'll do is I'll put those shackles on this spring here and get it hung. And then we'll check on the front one. I got the two left-hand springs mounted up there, and they went pretty easy. It wasn't too much trouble. It takes a little manipulation to get those in there, to get it lined up. Kind of tough to do with one person, but it can be done. A couple people, if you get one person to grab the spring and kind of twist it to get it lined up, and the other one to hold the driver and the hammer, it would work a little better, but I got it in there. It wasn't too big of a deal. I run into a little difficulty here. I got the springs on the left hand side. They're all mounted up nice. I was going to put the ones on the right hand side, but I need to get a bolt and go over there with the Dremel tool and kind of round out those holes so the bolts will fit through it. Well, I got to looking in my box, and I couldn't find any more bolts for the springs to hang the springs on. Well, I've spent the last hour and a half or so looking all over for those bolts. Determined that I couldn't find them, and I was probably going to have to go to town and get some bolts and drill them, tap them for zerts to use in there. Well, I got to looking on the parts list here, and I realized that those drilled bolts, they call them a wet bolt here, those are for the springs, shackles, and the ones that hold the equalizers on just require 2 regular bolts. That didn't help me much because I still couldn't find those bolts. They weren't in the box. I couldn't find those anywhere around. But I've got this other kit that I got for spring hangers. That spring hangers are too short to use on this trailer. They're quite a little bit different size, but they do have new bolts in them, so I can use these bolts for the equalizers. I've driven those two bolts into the spring hanger for those equalizers, so I'm going to have to take a nut over there and put on it and take the hammer and try to drive that back out. So I'll have those two bolts for those spring hangers, spring eyes. Hey, the springs are all mounted back on. They got them all torqued down. Next thing to do is to grease the zerts up on them, and I'll go get a grease gun and do that now. Now, torquing on those was not too big of a deal. Once I looked in the instructions, the torque on them is 30 to 50 pounds. That's a pretty wide range, so you don't really even need a torque wrench for that. Just tighten them up tight. Those nuts actually register against the shoulder on those bolts, so they don't really, you can't really over tighten them. They're still gonna leave a space in there on the bolt for everything to pivot on. It's not going to tighten those spring hangers down too tight, and it's not going to tighten those shackles down too tight. That's not really going to be a problem. Anyway, that's not as big a problem as you might think it would be. You can't really over tighten those except to strip them or something like that. But as far as tightening them too tight to pivot freely on those bushings, you can't really do that because they tighten up on those shoulders on the bolts. That's the reason they're there. I'll go get the grease gun and grease it up. Put some of this stuff away.